Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, anyways, when it comes down to it, I thought that I would talk about this little video that I thought would be very, very interesting to talk about. And of course, this video is yet again going to be by Dante's Boxing Nation. And like I said, I like to review certain videos, especially from other people, because I just kind of like the style of doing that. It gives them more of a podcast feeling when it comes down to it. And on top of that, it's just interesting to get other people's opinions, especially ones that I tend to find heavily delusional. I tend to review those videos because, all in all, I just think it makes it a little bit more entertaining. And on top of that, I do want to expose certain narratives that, in my opinion, can have some sort of double standards or, all in all, in my opinion, are just promoted heavily false or somewhat in a false way or without substantial evidence. So it is what it is. Anyways, we're going to be talking about a couple of fighters in this video. We're going to be talking about Canelo Alvarez. We're also going to be talking about Lomachenko. And these are two fighters, of course, for a very, very long time that new media has been trying to tear down. Why is that? Because they do not have the complexion for their protection. That's the reason why. Like I said, new media and the LDBC, pretty much what they are, at least the majority of them. And this isn't saying that I disagree with everything that they say. But when it comes down to the majority of the time, they have a very big pro-racial agenda. And the majority of the time, all in all, they're pretty much a big, gigantic pro-black cult. And like I said, a certain amount of people, they cannot like that, but it is what it is. I'm not trying to offend anybody, but if you watch their channels, that's pretty much what they are. It's very obvious. It just is what it is. And that's a big part of the reason why they tear down Canelo Alvarez so much, and Lomachenko, and Alexander Usyk, and Tyson Fury, but they won't tear down someone like a Gervonta Tank Davis, or the Charlo brothers, or someone of that sort. So it is what it is. There's a big reason why Dante spreads his narratives, why he does. It just is what it is. Anyways, let's get into the video. Let's talk about both Lomachenko and Canelo Alvarez, and let's get into it.
Award for Vasily Lomachenko to fight Shakur Stevenson at 130 pounds right now.
I think that it'll be a big reward. I think that he just lost to one young, hungry lion. It's another one that's calling your name too. And if you come back and try to, beat this one, and it'll look good. It'll look like what you were saying was right. That well, not what he was saying, what everybody else was saying. With the 135, that the weight was the problem. It'll look like that if he can come do that. But I promise you, there's no way that he could do that. Like, it's impossible. I would not let him beat me. Ain't no way a scared man could beat me.
And Shakur Stevenson, of course, is talking about Vasily Lomachenko. And he basically alleges that Vasily Lomachenko is afraid to fight him. Now, could Vasily Lomachenko possibly be afraid to fight Shakur Stevenson? It's possible. But I don't think Vasily Lomachenko is really focused on facing Shakur Stevenson. I think Vasily Lomachenko feels bothered by that loss to Teofimo Lopez. And I think all in all that he wants to be somewhat unified, at least at 135. Now, will he face Devin Haney? Who knows? Because Vasily Lomachenko didn't seem necessarily too interested in facing a Devin Haney, so we'll see what happens there. But I think Vasily Lomachenko's main target next, of course, is going to be George Kambosos. And in my opinion, if that fight happens, more than likely, Vasily Lomachenko will probably beat George Kambosos because, I've already said this, George Kambosos is a person with the belts. But when it comes down to it, out of any of the most recent unified champions, he might be the weakest unified champion that I've seen out of all these divisions. It just is what it is. I like George Kambosos. I think that he's a very decent fighter. And of course, I thought that he clearly beat Teofimo Lopez. But I think Teofimo really fought the worst possible fight possible against George Kambosos. I think that Vasily Lomachenko, Devin Haney, and Gervonta Tank Davis, I think every single one of those opponents can possibly beat him. Now, that doesn't mean that whoever gets that win, that it's not an A-grade win. I'd say that George Kambosos is an A- fighter. But he's not an A-grade fighter. He's not an A+ fighter. So we'll see what happens with that. But it'll be very, very interesting. And Vasily Lomachenko, more than likely, from what I hear, is probably going to get the George Kambosos fight next. And that's a big part of the reason why new media, as of right now, is trying to tear Vasily Lomachenko down once again. Because they realize that Vasily Lomachenko beats George Kambosos and gains his belts back, he's going to get a great amount of pound-for-pound claim. Now, let me talk about Vasily Lomachenko here for a second. Because I've made a certain amount of videos about Vasily Lomachenko within the past year, and I've had certain Vasily Lomachenko fans or certain people tell me that they disagree with my analysis about Vasily Lomachenko. What I'm going to say is this. I think Vasily Lomachenko is a very special fighter. And obviously Vasily Lomachenko is not some hype job. He's a person that is a real deal fighter. You cannot defeat as many A-class fighters as he's defeated, or defeat the type of class of fighters that he's defeated, and overall not be an A-class fighter. He embarrassed Gary Russell Jr., he embarrassed Nicholas Walters, he completely embarrassed Guillermo Rigondeaux, and of course he was also able to beat Jorge Linares when he was on top of the 135-pound division. But that was then and this is now. And at the end of the day, Vasily Lomachenko, I do think that he was the former number one pound-for-pound fighter in the world. I think that he deserved that acclaim. But at the end of the day, when you fought the biggest challenge of your career at 135 with Teofimo Lopez, not only did you lose, but you pretty much did not take enough chances in that fight, and you fought scared. And then you made excuses overall about your shoulder. And I don't want to hear anything about that, because to me it did not look like your shoulder was injured in that fight. So a certain amount of people, they can get on my ass about that all they want to, but that's the bottom line about Vasily Lomachenko. I think that he's a very special fighter, but I cannot put him on that level, at least as of right now, as a Canelo Alvarez or even some of the other ones that I have in my top 10 pound for pound. Unless Vasily Lomachenko comes back and gets a series of A-grade wins, I'm not going to put him in my top 5 pound for pound, because that loss to Teofimo Lopez, sure, it was against an extraordinary fighter in Teofimo Lopez, at least at the time, but at the end of the day, you had to really perform a hell of a lot better than what you did. And Canelo Alvarez, even him sometimes with physical disadvantages, when he moves up the weight classes, he has performed better overall than Vasily Lomachenko, at least in the bigger fights. So it is what it is. Of course, the David Benavidez and Jermall Charlo fights still have to happen. But when it comes down to it, Canelo Alvarez usually has performed extremely well. And Canelo has actually shown me versus Vasily Lomachenko that he's actually better defensively than what Vasily Lomachenko is. Because if you go to Vasily Lomachenko's body, especially if you're a little bit more on the lengthier side, such as a Teofimo Lopez or a Devin Haney, at least compared to him, he really had no answers for that. Now, it does look like he's been adjusting to that a little bit. So hopefully for Vasily Lomachenko's sake, he can perform better than what he did in the Teofimo Lopez match against that of bigger opponents. But we'll see what happens. Like I said, Vasily Lomachenko, you can debate him in my current top 10 pound for pound, but he cannot be in my top 5. You just can't be. You have no belts, and on top of that, when it comes down to it, the last big A-grade fight you were in, you lost. It is what it is. So, at the end of the day, Vasily Lomachenko, I think that he is a great fighter. But if he wants to be back in that top 5 pound for pound discussion, if he wants to be up there with Canelo, Terrence Crawford, Errol Spence Jr., Tyson Fury, Alexander Usyk, because those are my top 5, if you want to be up there with them, you're going to have to get a series of A-grade wins, no doubt about it. Which means what? Not only George Kambosos, but you're going to have to get a win over Devin Haney possibly, and also Gervonta Tank Davis. If he were to get a win over Gervonta Tank Davis, he may make my top 5 pound for pound, because in my opinion, Gervonta Tank Davis is a debatable top 10 pound for pound fighter. If he's not top 10 pound for pound, in my opinion, he would be top 15. But anyway.
Boxing Nation, what's going on, guys? So once again, it looks like all of the fights that the fans want to see will most likely not happen. It's just so crazy because even old media, leading up to the Devin Haney fight, old media, new media, they were all asking Kambosos, so who's it going to be? Are you going to fight Gervonta Tank Davis, or are you going to fight against Devin Haney? Do you know when it came to old media, no one mentioned Lomachenko's name? They only mentioned Tank Davis. And
well, this is a thing that I'm saying about you, Dante. You seem to have a huge problem that George Kambosos could possibly face Vasily Lomachenko next. But you had no problem basically saying that he was going to face Gervonta Tank Davis next. Now, if you look at Gervonta Tank Davis as more of a legitimate threat to George Kambosos, that's up to you. But at the end of the day, it's like this. Dante claims that overall that he wants George Kambosos to face Devin Haney because overall he should face for undisputed. When in all reality, Dante, he really doesn't care about that. I mean, I'm not saying that he doesn't care about that. But as long as it's a fighter that he likes, he doesn't care. That's why Dante just told you that he would have been perfectly okay with George Kambosos facing Gervonta Tank Davis. Now, of course, Gervonta Tank Davis is undefeated. And all in all, Gervonta Tank Davis, he is someone that, is very, very dangerous. And he does not have a recent loss in his career like Lomachenko. But Lomachenko, at the end of the day, Dante's already said this. He said overall that he believes that Lomachenko will beat George Kambosos. So at the end of the day, it's still a very challenging fight. But the problem isn't necessarily that George Kambosos, is facing a very tough challenger. The problem is that he's facing Lomachenko for Dante's Boxing Nation. Why is that? Because he doesn't want Lomachenko to get back those belts, and he does not want him back on the top pound-for-pound list?
Devin Haney's name. Because they knew that those were the biggest fights to make and the fights that made all the sense in the world, right? So what does Kambosos attempt to do? Pull a page out of Canelo Alvarez's book. I remember before the Canelo versus Caleb Plant fight, there were a lot of Canelo Alvarez fans in the comment section already defending Canelo, telling everybody to shut up, he's gonna fight one of the big names next. Who else was there for him to fight?
Well, in my opinion, Caleb Plant was one of the big names. Like I said, I don't understand why Dante, well, I do understand why, but I don't understand how so many people fall into this narrative that Caleb Plant was just this weak-ass champion. In my opinion, Caleb Plant all around was more troubling for Canelo and was more skilled than that of the David Benavidez. Now, who knows? Maybe David Benavidez will be more challenging for that of a Canelo Alvarez, but I doubt it. And the reason why I say that is because, yes, I know David Benavidez. I know all in all that he's probably an all-around better athlete than Caleb Plant. But Caleb Plant, in my opinion, he's better defensively when it comes down to than David Benavidez. At least, debatably. He's slicker than David Benavidez when it comes down to it. Now, that doesn't always mean that, that fighter who's maybe not as slick won't give him more problems. But David Benavidez, when I take a look at him, like I said, he reminds me of the regular, straightforward Mexican or Mexican-American fighter that I usually see. Don't get me wrong, he's more talented than the usual one, but David Benavidez does not really have A-grade defense. He doesn't have A-grade head movement. I've seen him have a bunch of problems with a certain amount of opponents. And on top of that, you don't really have A-grade power. Like I said, he's kind of like the Max Holloway of boxing, just like a lesser version of him. Max Holloway isn't someone that's going to knock you out with one punch, but he'll knock you out with punches and bunches. That's what he does. So, David Benavidez, I think, is a good fighter. I think that he's an A-grade name, but I don't know why so many people truly believe that David Benavidez is just going to knock Canelo Alvarez out or be this super huge threat compared to Caleb Plant. Because David Benavidez, in my opinion, he's just nowhere near defensively responsible enough to beat Canelo Alvarez.
This is what Canelo Alvarez fans were saying. Some Canelo Alvarez fans, they were saying, I would rather see Canelo fight Bivol or Beterbiev over a Charlo or Andre. We already know what that's about.
I would like to see that as well because, in my opinion, Beterbiev or Bivol, they're bigger threats to Canelo Alvarez than a Demetrius Andrade or, all in all, than that of a Jamal Charlo. And if that were to happen next, I would have no problem with it because, like I said, Dante, he always tries to spread this bullshit about how Canelo Alvarez is allegedly avoiding these guys. And I'm not saying that Canelo Alvarez, that, like I said, with Demetrius Andrade, that maybe he doesn't realize that Andrade is a little bit of a threat because he doesn't seem super interested in that fight. But I do believe that the Jamal Charlo and David Benavidez fights will happen eventually. But if Canelo is going to face Artur Beterbiev or Dimitri Bivol next, especially without a weight drain, Dante really shouldn't have a problem with that. Because those fighters are real deal fighters. Like Artur Beterbiev especially, he's debatably a top 10 pound-for-pound fighter.
That's about that MBF. No black fighters. Because it's still MBF all day for Canelo. Don't get it twisted, y'all. By the way, that MBF image that I used, that was from Southpaw's channel. Go ahead and subscribe to his channel. MBF means Canelo Alvarez is avoiding.
Go ahead and check out Southpaw's channel. Southpaw is one of these crazy-ass dudes. Another big part of the pro-black cult member when it comes down to it all in all. Southpaw is even worse than any of these other dudes that I've seen. I mean, that dude is clearly out of his goddamn mind.
The dangerous, the undefeated black fighters. It doesn't count if you're fighting against some African no one has heard of who's been knocked out twice, has no defense, has no speed, no rhythm, no...
Right, but you show his fight against Tony Bellew. But why don't you show his fight overall against some of the undefeated contenders? This is my thing about Dante. If you want to say that Canelo Alvarez's next fight against Makabu, or however you pronounce his name, isn't the greatest of fights, I would somewhat see your points. But then Dante, when he tries to promote Devin Haney against Jorge Linares, go ahead and check out his videos. When Jorge Linares was knocked out 2 times in like his past 4 fights, he says, oh, Devin Haney is stepping up against a real good fighter. He's in the best condition of his career. Like, what the hell are you talking about? At least when Canelo Alvarez is fighting Makabu, he's a WBC champion at the cruiserweight division, and he at least has some good wins within his past 3 fights. He's defeated some undefeated prospects in that division, and on top of that, Makabu has some real knockout power. Like I said, go ahead and watch some of his highlights. This dude has real knockout power. So, like I said, I don't have a problem with Canelo Alvarez facing someone at cruiserweight. Or facing him at cruiserweight anyway.
Doesn't have a chin. All he has is a belt.
Doesn't have a chin. He's only been knocked out twice in his career. Someone that doesn't have a chin is an Amir Khan when he fought Terrence Crawford, but you didn't say shit about that. Or a Kell Brook when he fought a Terrence Crawford when he was complete mincemeat, but you'll give Terrence Crawford credit for fighting those washed up fighters. Anyway.
That does not count. Imagine if there was a black American fighter in the welterweight division, and let's just say hypothetically, all of the lions, all of the best and most dangerous fighters in that division were Mexican. They're all going after this one black champion in particular, right? Let's say it's Floyd Mayweather.
But if you're trying to say all in all that's the series with Canelo Alvarez, that's not the series with Canelo Alvarez. That's not the point with Canelo. You can't really say that because, once again, Dante always tries to spread this bullshit that there's so many elite black champions around Canelo Alvarez's divisions. There's only 2 black fighters that he hasn't fought as of yet, and 1 Mexican fighter that he hasn't fought as of yet within those divisions. That's Jamal Charlo, who in my opinion has looked very suspect in a certain amount of his fights anyway. And then, Demetrius Andrade. And then, of course, you got David Benavidez. But like I said, these guys, they're pretty much somewhat on the same level. Some may even be below that of a Caleb Plant when it comes down to it, in my opinion. Like, if you're talking about peak Caleb Plant and peak Jamal Charlo, I don't think Jamal Charlo would beat Caleb Plant. He might beat him now after Canelo Alvarez knocked him out, and probably he's never going to be the same again. But when it comes down to it, in my opinion, Jamal Charlo, I think that he's gotten very, very lucky with the opponents that he has faced. Because if we're really being, real about Jamal Charlo, what real A-grade fighters has Jamal Charlo fought, really?
In all of these
of course, he fought J-Rock Williams, but J-Rock Williams is a very suspect fighter as well. Take a look at how his career has panned out. He was undefeated at the time. I'll give Jamal Charlo that much credit, but, Julian J-Rock Williams, he's a decent fighter, but all in all, he has a lot of flaws in his game, and on top of that, he has a chin made out of paper mache. So, it is what it is.
Dangerous Mexicans are calling out Floyd Mayweather in the same division. Canelo Alvarez, Oscar De La Hoya, Virgil Ortiz. And while the boxing world is expecting Floyd to fight one of them next, instead, who does he fight? He fights Brandon Rios, a man who's already been knocked out multiple times.
Right, but Dante, overall, he's trying to make this comparison, but at the end of the day, it falls flat on its face. Because let's be real, Canelo Alvarez is fighting Makabu. Like I said, this is why I compare it to the Roy Jones Jr. versus John Ruiz fight. That's what that is. Because, yes, it's a fighter that, in my opinion, is obviously not A-grade, but it's a fighter that clearly outsizes Canelo Alvarez. And from what I hear, Canelo will be facing at 200 pounds, but we'll see what happens. So, like I said, I don't have a problem with that fight. But if you were to talk about Mayweather versus Brandon Rios, those are 2 fighters all in all. Now, Mayweather, I guess, is a little bit outside that welterweight, of course. But that would be like Canelo facing, like I said, Anthony Yard at light heavyweight. Or someone overall that is clearly not impressive at this point in time anymore. Makabu, of course, he's not an A-grade fighter. But like I said, he is natural cruiserweight. So that's why I don't have a problem with that fight.
Real quick before I finish that point, this image that I just put on the screen, this was an animation that I created. I at least created the concept of it. This was all of the lightweights avoiding Devin Haney. I said to myself one day, there's so many lightweights avoiding Devin Haney, they could create a team. Lightweights avoiding.
Well, hold on. Let's rewind this for a second.
A man who's already been knocked out multiple times. And real quick before I finish that point, this image that I just put on the screen, this was an animation that I created. I at least created the concept of it. This was all of the lightweights avoiding Devin Haney. I said to myself one day, there's so many lightweights avoiding Devin Haney, they could create a team. So I created the team, the Lightweight Dodgers. And now Cambosos.
I do believe that there are a certain amount of lightweights avoiding Devin Haney, including Vasily Lomachenko and George Kambosos. I don't necessarily have a problem with that. But then when it comes to Gervonta Tank Davis also not being interested in facing, let's be real about Gervonta Tank Davis here for a second. Gervonta's not only interested in not fighting Devin Haney, he don't want to fight anyone elite. He'll fight Ryan Garcia because he knows that Ryan Garcia pretty much is the weakest link, and he had no problem calling out George Kambosos. But then, you don't want to call out Vasily Lomachenko or, overall Devin Haney. That's interesting. And, people always give so much credit to Gervonta because that one time he called out Josh Taylor. Well, where's the call out of Josh Taylor now? How come I haven't heard it?
This is looking.
So like I said, I like Gervonta. I think Gervonta is a fantastic fighter. But that dude's been selling wolf tickets for the majority of his career.
To join the team. So back to my scenario. Floyd Mayweather, he fights Brandon Rios, a guy that has been knocked out multiple times before, right? And will be a heavy underdog. Matter of fact, let's turn this...
Right, but that's not the same. Because Canelo Alvarez is facing someone that is going to outweigh him by 20 damn pounds, if not more. That's why it's different. Possibly even 30 pounds. Who the hell knows? Now, if there's a catch weight or, a weight drain, then I'm wrong. But when it comes down to, and the Floyd Mayweather fans, I always try to give you this bullshit about, the majority of fighters that Floyd fought, they were 20 pounds bigger. No, they weren't. There was a few fighters here and there that were, the majority bigger. Like Victor Ortiz was bigger when it comes down to it. But, Floyd let him rehydrate because he knew Victor Ortiz's skill set wasn't all that. It is what it is. Let's be real. But when it came to Canelo Alvarez, there was a reason why he had a rehydration clause. All right, let's be real. Now, I don't have a problem with that. Floyd beat Canelo Alvarez fair and square. Whether you want to count the rehydration clause or not. But when it comes down to it at the end of the day, this narrative that Floyd on average fought fighters that were 20 pounds heavier, that's a bunch of horse shit. The majority of fighters that he fought would rehydrate usually at the biggest at around 160. That's about 10 to maybe 13 pounds bigger.
Into a complete Canelo Alvarez scenario. So Floyd Mayweather actually moves up 2 weight classes because Brandon Rios has a belt.
So this is what I say. This would be like Mayweather. Actually, I think that this is a good comparison. This would be like if Floyd Mayweather Jr. went up to the middleweight division and would have beaten that one fighter like, say, an Andy Lee. Now, a lot of people overall don't remember who Andy Lee is. Or maybe someone like a Peter Quillen. Someone like that. Now, some people say, Peter Quillen, overall he was a better fighter than Makabu. Well, was he really? Because Peter Quillen in some of his bigger fights, he wasn't really that good. It is what it is. That's kind of what Floyd Mayweather Jr., that's what it would be like. It would be a Floyd, in my opinion. Now, of course, he was already sized at welterweight. But Canelo, he's outsized pretty much at super middleweight overall and even light heavyweight. Even though he rehydrates to a great degree, but he does not have the reach. He does not have the height a lot of the times to compete with these guys, but somehow he still finds a way to get out of it. So that would be like Floyd, at least in terms of height and reach, if he were to go all the way up to middleweight and face someone like an Andy Lee or a Peter Quillen for the championship. That's what that would be like.
Up there.
I'm not going to compare it to a Gennady Golovkin or something like that because I think Gennady, of course, at his peak is way better than that of a Makabu. But,
And remember, Brandon Rios, he's been knocked out about 2 or 3 times. And going into this fight, he is an underdog. Mexican fans, would you be sitting over here talking about how great Floyd Mayweather is because he moved up 2 weight classes and completely dominated the bigger champion, Brandon Rios? Would you be running around...
Well, right, but Brandon Rios overall, Brandon Rios isn't that much smaller than Floyd Mayweather Jr. So that fight really has no appeal because Floyd Mayweather Jr., he's not a natural welterweight, but he can fight there because he's a person with a 72-inch reach, which is a decently long reach for him. And a lot of welterweights, they don't even have a 72-inch reach. Canelo is a person that has only about a 71-inch reach at max when it comes down to it, and he's facing fighters sometimes that are bigger than him, at least significantly. So it is what it is.
Telling people that Floyd Mayweather beat the best Mexicans in the sport? Would you even give him credit for beating this Mexican fighter? I mean, we could even use Makabu as an example for Floyd Mayweather. Let's say Floyd never fought Manny Pacquiao. He never fought Shane Mosley, never fought Canelo Alvarez, Diego Corrales, Jenner Hernandez, Ricky Hatton, Juan Manuel Marquez. And you know why I mentioned those names in particular? Is because every single one of those fighters I mentioned, they were on the top 10 pound for pound list. The same pound for...
Well, some of them were on the top 10 pound per pound list. I'm not sure if every single one of those guys were on the top 10 pound per pound list at the time Floyd fought him, but maybe they were. Listen, it's very hard to get Floyd Mayweather Jr.'s resume. I don't know if Canelo is even going to get to Floyd Mayweather Jr.'s resume. But at the end of the day, we cannot, really look at Canelo's resume and tear it down because, like I said, the man has fought so many A-class fighters.
Pound list that old media uses today and uses as their favorite fighter list instead. So let's imagine Floyd.
You mean like you do? Because Devin Haney does not belong in the top 10 pound for pound list. Deontay Wilder never belonged in the top 10 pound for pound list. Neither Charlo brother, belongs on the top 10 pound for pound list. But yet you'll put them there. Huh.
Mayweather, he never fought any of those guys. But he jumped up to a higher weight class. He beat a Rocky Fielding. Then he jumped up 2 weight classes higher and he beat Makabu. Right?
Yes, of course, but a Rocky Fielding is completely different from a Makabu fight or a Makabu. And the reason why that is because Makabu, he's going to be significantly bigger than that of a Canelo Alvarez. Rocky Fielding, Canelo's, in the 168-pound weight class, he's only outsized by probably 1 weight class. So, of course, that isn't going to be looked at as special. That would be kind of like Floyd Mayweather, at the welterweight division. Now, one could argue that Floyd really was a natural, in terms of weight, was a natural 135-pounder. But the reason why I compare it to welterweight is because those are really the guys that are going to be near his own same size, because Floyd is very lengthy overall for his size, so he can handle it, just kind of like Terrence Bud Crawford. Terrence could even move up to 154 or 160 and possibly handle himself because Terrence Crawford has a 74-inch reach. So it is what it is. But Canelo Alvarez, he doesn't have that type of reach. He only has a 71-inch reach. So he has to be even better defensively sometimes than some of those other fighters. Now, does that mean saying that Canelo is all around better defensively than Floyd Mayweather Jr.? No. But when it comes down to it, what I am saying is that if you take a look at defense, at least compared to today's fighters, compared to any other fighter, I don't care who it is, whether it be Vasily Lomachenko, Terrence Crawford, Alexander Usyk, there is no better defensive fighter today than that of Canelo Alvarez.
Then he unified all the belts, beating Caleb Plant, BJ Saunders, Caleb Smith, and Abdi Yildirim. Mexican fans, be honest. Would you be sitting over here saying, oh, shut up, you guys are just jealous. Floyd Mayweather is pound for pound the best. You guys are just jealous. Floyd Mayweather can do whatever he wants. He can fight whoever he wants. That's something else that never made sense, and I've asked a couple fans.
Well, Dante, you're not really making a whole lot of sense right now because, like I said, would you do that for any of the demographics? No, you wouldn't. You don't stick up for any of the demographics. So it is what it is. As I've said this a million times, at the end of the day, whatever demographic they are, they're going to stick up for their own demographic, at least usually. It just is what it is. All right? But at the end of the day, do I think that Canelo has the resume of a Floyd Mayweather? No, of course not. But at the end of the day, Canelo does have a great resume. No doubt about it.
In my comment section.
And he certainly has the best resume out of any other fighter today. This is why it never made any sense. Dante, in the same sentence, will say that Canelo Alvarez, that he's ducking and dodging and, he doesn't fight elite fighters. But then in the same sentence say that Terrence Crawford, this is why he's number 1 pound for pound. Take a look at his resume. Like, what are you talking about, dude?
Mexican fans who have said Canelo could do whatever he wants. I asked this one Canelo fan. I said, how would that benefit you as a boxing fan? If a fighter is fighting whoever he wants and not fighting the guys that us boxing fans want to see him fight. How does that benefit you as a boxing fan? The guy never responded to the question.
Well, that's an easy question if you're a fanboy of that person, and if you don't want to see them lose, then of course, not facing the elite fighters overall, of course, can help them. That can benefit them. It is what it is. By still facing elite level competition somewhere else. Maybe pulling like what a Mikey Garcia did. But like I said, I don't have a problem with what Canelo Alvarez is doing because he's facing elite fighters. It's not like like I said, it's not like a Mikey Garcia move where Mikey Garcia clearly is slithering in and out of the divisions and usually facing the weakest champions there. And when he finally fought a legitimate champion in Errol Spence Jr., the only reason why he did that was to avoid a Vasily Lomachenko or someone else within that weight class.
Why he didn't respond? Because these decafs, dumb casual-ass fans, and old media, when they say Canelo can fight whoever he wants, that means as long as he's not losing to some undefeated, dangerous black fighter, they're okay with him taking on the easiest competition because they like the status that comes with it. See, when
I would agree with that somewhat, but Dante, let's be real, you also used to use Caleb Plant's and Billy Joe Saunders' name in order to tear down Canelo Alvarez. And once he fought those fighters and defeated them and stopped them, what were you saying? You basically said that, those fighters, they weren't that good when it comes down to it. So Dante will basically say, like I said, and I've said this before, he'll say anything basically to get his point across.
Old media uses terms like
Dante is a person that you really cannot trust because he's a person that, once again, he'll say anything. He has no consistency.
pound for pound, or even undisputed. For fighters like Kambosos, Teofimo, they're using that status as a badge to say, now you don't have to fight any of these dangerous black fighters because you made it through the dangerous waters, avoided the sharks, and now you don't have to jump back in the water if you don't want to. This is what they're telling you. Someone sent me an article the other day, and the headline of the article reads,
Dante, I understand overall what you're getting at, but if you truly do believe that Canelo Alvarez is avoiding some of these black fighters and Latino fighters, why is the same energy not coming with Gervonta Tank Davis? You can't sit here and tell me with a straight face that Isaac Cruz is a person that really is as good as a Teofimo Lopez, or someone all in all that is as good as a Ryan Garcia or some of these other guys within the weight division, or a Jose Ramirez, or, a Josh Taylor or something else like that. Gervonta hasn't fought anyone like that yet, but yet you'd place Gervonta Tank Davis within your top 5 pound for pound.
WBC calling Kambosos undisputed champion makes Haney fight unnecessary. This proves everything that I'm telling you guys. They're using these belts and these fake undisputed claims as a license to avoid dangerous black fighters. Usually it's the contrary. Once a fighter starts getting all the belts and he's young in his prime, he continues to go after the best competition. Before Anthony Joshua lost to Usyk,
Almost every single fighter has avoided someone. Let me say that real quick. Almost every single fighter has fought someone. There's no fighter out there that, in my opinion, that 100% of the time fought everyone, and if they did, it was because they already suffered a loss. Now, my opinion, is that me saying that it's okay to duck and avoid fighters? No. But there's a lot of fighters out there that avoided certain matchups. It is what it is.
At the majority of the belts at heavyweight, and he still wanted to fight Tyson Fury, right? Imagine if Terrence Crawford had 3 of the 4 belts at welterweight. Matter of fact, imagine Errol Spence as the WBC champion, and then the WBC president decides to make Terrence Crawford the franchise champion. Do you guys think that Crawford is going to stop going after Errol Spence? We know.
Well, Terrence Crawford has allegedly been going after Errol Spence and all the big boy welterweights for a very long time. But like I said, he was with Top Rank for a very, very long time. So it is what it is. He was the one that decided to re-sign with them. So that's his problem.
What time it is? We know he's still going to push for that fight because Terrence Crawford, he wants to show everyone that there is nobody on the planet that can beat him. See, it would be completely different if fighters like Teofimo Lopez and George Kambosos, they completely cleaned out the division. They beat Gervonta Tank Davis, Devin Haney, Lomachenko. They beat everyone, right? Moved up to 140.
So you just said all in all that Lomachenko really is a big threat, so you should have no problem with George Kambosos facing Vasily Lomachenko next. Because you know just as I do that Lomachenko is a very tough test for anyone out there. You would have no problem if Gervonta Tank Davis was facing Vasily Lomachenko next. Or Devin Haney, so I don't want to hear that bitching.
Beat Josh Taylor. Beat whoever was dangerous there. They dominated the sport for a good 10 years. Now they're just chilling, right? Now they're just saying, you know what, man, I can fight whoever I want to fight. I've already stamped my legacy. Then it's way more understandable for fighters to talk the way Kambosos, Teofimo, and old media is talking today. They're telling these 22, 23-year-old fighters you can fight whoever you want. From this point in your career, you can fight whoever you want. Well, hell, if that's the case, they should have said this to Floyd Mayweather after he beat Diego Corrales. Hell, after he beat Janir Hernandez.
Well, listen, what I'm going to say is this. Are there certain racial double standards, in my opinion, against black fighters? Probably, yes. Certainly. But when it comes down to it, all in all, bottom line is this. When it comes down to it overall, like I said, to criticize Canelo Alvarez, at least with the resume that he has, I think ultimately is just ridiculous because he really has shown me that he's taken on a certain amount of challenges. Now, of course, I would love to see Jamal Charlo and David Benavidez and Demetrius Andrade a little bit later on. But I do believe that those challenges a little bit later on will come. And it's not like Canelo Alvarez can outage them because Canelo Alvarez is older than them. So it is what it is.
When he was around 21, 22, and 23. The only fighters today that truly believe that they are the best are fighters like Devin Haney, Shakur Stevenson, Stephen Fulton, Terrence Crawford, David Benavidez, Demetrius Andrade, and Josh Taylor. See, all those fighters that I mentioned, they don't have the luxury of being a heavyweight where you have no choice.
Now, why didn't he mention someone like a Tyson Fury? Because Tyson Fury has never ducked and avoided a fight. Or at least overall, he took the Deontay Wilder third fight. You know, but why won't he mention someone like a Tyson Fury? Because he hates his guts.
But to fight the best fighters in the division. You can't escape to a different weight class. You can't do any of those things, right? These fighters that I just mentioned, they pretty much have options to either go the Canelo Alvarez route or go the Floyd Mayweather route. It is so amazing to me how so many fighters that are willing to do things that Canelo is not willing to do right now. Fighters that are much better.
So, which fighters overall are willing to do something that Canelo Alvarez is not willing to do? Once again, sure, Canelo as of yet has not fought the Charlo brothers, or to be honest, I think the only one that's worth the fight for Canelo is Jamal, because I think that he's the better out of the two, but it is what it is. Anyways, when it comes down to it, the only fights, once again, that have not taken place with Canelo have been Jamal, Andrade, and Benavidez. Those are the only ones. But like I said, I can't overall get after Canelo too much because I think Caleb Plant, you can debate overall that he was a bigger threat than almost any of those fighters. So it is what it is. Besides maybe Andrade, but it is what it is.
Then Canelo Alvarez are showing him respect as if he's on their level. And Canelo's not on their level. We all know
Canelo Alvarez is not only on their level, he's above their level. There's no fighter in the world today that is on the Canelo Alvarez level.
what would happen if Canelo and Shakur were naturally the same weight. If Devin and Canelo were naturally the same weight.
Right, but you can't compare it like that. You have to basically say, what have they done for their divisions? It just is what it is. That's why you can't compare heavyweights overall and certain people overall like Canelo Alvarez to the lower weight classes. You can't compare them. Sure, you can try to compare skill sets, but usually the bigger guys, they don't usually look as fast or as swift or sometimes even as skilled, depending what weight class it is. But does Canelo always look as 100% skilled? Does he always look like he has as good a head movement or footwork as, say, someone like a Devonta Tank Davis or a Vasily Lomachenko? No, not always. But at the end of the day, we know for his weight divisions that it's enough for him to become the best fighters there. Like I said, any division that Canelo Alvarez has touched as of recently, he's usually been the best fighter there.
If Terrence Crawford, if Gervonta Tank Davis, if they were all naturally the same weight, Canelo Alvarez loses all of those fights hands down.
Well, how do you know that? How do you know that? Let me actually rewind it. Let me hear of all the fighters that he mentioned.
We all know what would happen if Canelo and Shakur were naturally the same weight. If Devin and Canelo were naturally the same weight. If Terrence Crawford, if Gervonta Tank Davis.
And if you're even going to make that point when it comes down to it, just because Canelo Alvarez has not fought Jamal Charlo or Andrade, I don't know if that really helps your case, because I think all in all that if they were the same weight class, I don't think Andrade or Charlo would beat Shakur Stevenson or overall Gervonta Tank Davis. They certainly wouldn't, because they're not as skilled all in all,
If they were all naturally the same weight, Canelo Alvarez loses all of those fights hands down. And deep down, the Mexican fans that are...
But like I said, there's no way to constitute that. I can sit here and basically say that, if Tyson Fury, if he was in the lower weight classes, there's no way he'd beat some of the bigger fighters, but there's no way to constitute that. But you notice once again that that he never said this with Deontay Wilder, before Tyson Fury whooped that ass. Or he never said this, with certain other fighters that he had to protect.
Diehard Canelo fans, they even know it's true. Of course, they're not going to admit it, but they know deep down. They know what it is. Because time and time again, these type of Mexican fans I'm talking about, and I'm not talking about all of them, obviously, we're excluding the non-racist ones, but the racist ones I'm talking about, they have watched so many of their favorite Mexican fighters, from Oscar De La Hoya to Canelo Alvarez to Fernando Vargas to Chavez Sr. to Marco Antonio Barrera.
I don't know why Fernando Vargas always gets mentioned in with some of the great Mexican fighters, because he wasn't a great fighter at all. So many people always, say this bullshit. Even certain ones that aren't Mexican fans, they say, oh man, Fernando Vargas, he was a machine back in the day. I think the biggest win of his career is like over Winky Wright, but every other big fight in his career he lost. Man had a chin made out of paper mache, and on top of that, he was not as skilled as many people try to prop him up to be. I have no idea why the hell he gets mentioned in some of those big fights. But it is what it is, or as great as some of those other fighters, because he's not.
To Antonio Margarito, Juan Manuel Marquez. You know what all of those fighters I just named have in common? Every single last one of them suffered their very first loss to a black fighter. So,
well, some of them did, not every single one of them. But if Dante's trying to make the point, I'll know that black fighters are usually more dominant in the sport of boxing. I don't usually have a problem with that. I don't really have a problem with that because, I mean, that's true. Usually American black fighters especially, they tend to be the most dominant fighters within the whole entire sport. But that's a big part of the reason why Dante's Boxing Nation is so bothered. Because he wants a black fighter at the top of the pound for pound. That's what he wants. And it bothers him that Canelo Alvarez, as of right now, is looked at as the number one pound for pound fighter.
A lot of these races...
Now, some people may say, well, it's because he hasn't fought Andre or Charlo or Benavidez yet. Bullshit, because every single fighter that Canelo Alvarez eventually fought that Dante was trying to use to say that Canelo Alvarez was avoiding them, he eventually threw them under the bus, or basically said that Canelo doesn't deserve a lot of credit for them, for beating them because of this, because of this, because of this. Whether it be Cotto or Golovkin or Billy Joe Saunders or Danny Jacobs or Araceli Lara, he hasn't given Canelo Alvarez credit for almost any of those fights.
Fans, they already know what time it is. This is the reason why the whole truth is their kryptonite.
And of course you have Bernard Hopkins here, who is one of the most overrated fighters in history, in my opinion. Great fighter, but not top 10, not top 20.
You could call me whatever you want to call me, but one thing you will not call me is a damn liar. Because I could pull up all the receipts.
Well, you are kind of a liar, Dante. Not only are you a liar, but you're definitely delusional. Not only are you delusional, but you're two-faced when it comes down to it. And on top of that, when it comes down to it, you're very, very biased. It just is what it is. You'll basically say anything, overall to get your point across. That's why I said, when you take a look at his Tyson Fury versus Deontay Wilder videos, when it comes down to it, you can take a look at him for yourself if you don't believe me. He basically was giving all this praise to Deontay Wilder, calling him an all-time great heavyweight. And then as soon as Deontay Wilder lost to Tyson Fury that third time, when it came down to it, basically a third time anyway, what did he say? Oh, well, Tyson Fury, he's never really defeated that complete of a heavyweight. So Dante, once again, he'll say anything to get his point across. So you cannot trust Dante in the long run.
You want me to. So with that being said, old media is trying to destroy the sport of boxing. Like I said, they are going to push for Kambosos.
Well, like I said, when it comes down to it all in all, I don't completely disagree with Dante saying overall that certain people do avoid black fighters. But just because Canelo Alvarez is ranked as the number one overall pound-for-pound fighter, does that mean that people are trying to destroy boxing? No, because Canelo Alvarez, he's fought great fighters. And like I said, when you take a look at his resume, there's no resume right now in boxing that's better than Canelo Alvarez's.
Now to fight against Lomachenko, and neither one of those guys wants to fight the WBC champion, Devin Haney. So we're going to keep seeing these MBF scenarios play out. We're going to keep seeing these Teofimo Lopez, Oscar Valdez, Jaime Munguia, Kambosos, and now Lomachenko play these MBF games in the sport of boxing.
Well, Lomachenko's going after undisputed. So it is what it is. I don't necessarily have a problem with that, but what I will say is this. Lomachenko did not seem completely interested overall in facing a Devin Haney. So Lomachenko, he is eventually going to have to face a Devin Haney, whether he gets those belts or not. So we'll see what happens.
Continue to fight against opponents that no fans are asking to watch if we as the people don't do anything about it. Power is definitely in numbers.
Dante, let's be real, and I'm not trying to be mean towards Devin Haney here, but there's only one type of demographic that really wants to see Devin Haney versus George Kambosos next, and we all know which group that is. It just is what it is. The majority of people, including myself, would actually really love to see Vasily Lomachenko versus George Kambosos because we all know that George Kambosos is the weakest link there. It just is what it is. But don't get me wrong, overall, Devin Haney versus George Kambosos would be a great fight, and I do hope that Devin Haney eventually gets his shot.
And if you combine new media with social media and everyone speaks against the injustices and the double standards of the sport of boxing, then we can make a change. And one day this sport will look like the UFC, where all the fighters fight the best all the time. this sport will...
Well, the reason why that is because they don't have a choice. Boxing is never going to look like the UFC. It just never is. It has way too many organizations. It has way too many belts. Now, if it were just all for one belt, in my opinion, or maybe for two belts, then maybe it would be a lot easier. But in the UFC, when it comes down to it, there is no choice for them. Dana White, overall, he pretty much has a monopoly. He is the president. Whatever he says goes when it comes down to it. He has a very, very big iron fist over them. Boxing is never going to be as UFC is. It just never is. Because the company, the business is just built completely different.
Look like the NFL, the NBA, where all the teams play against the best in every single season. That's the way boxing is supposed to be. So all of you guys need to keep making your voice heard on Twitter, on Instagram, and all these other social accounts. And I'm going to do the same thing over here on my YouTube. That's all I got for now, guys. I'm on to the next one.
Anyways, that's overall all I got for today. But when it comes to the Devin Haney situation, I have to agree with Dante a little bit that Devin Haney is someone avoided. Do I believe that George Kambosos and Vasily Lomachenko realize him as a threat? Yes, I do. So hopefully Devin Haney eventually gets his shot. Hopefully Canelo also does eventually face a Jamal Charlo and David Benavidez. But I believe that he will face those fighters. But once again, I can't criticize Canelo Alvarez to a high degree because Canelo has fought such repeated A-grade competition. It just is what it is. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to y'all later.